I think that the fundamental question is that we need a better understanding of two things. One, the strategies and tactics of social movements or of civil society organization. What works, what doesn't, why does some things work, under what conditions they work and under what conditions. I don't think that there's enough research on it. There's a lot of activists who've reflected this, but there's not sufficient strategic research by the scholarly community on these issues. The second, I think, is we have to ask the question, why is it that as we've expanded civil society, so too inequality has increased in the world? If the goal of civil society is to get rid of inequality, how is it that it's increasing? Clearly something else is playing out. And we have to understand the broader economic and political context within which civil society plays itself out. Because if we don't understand that, we don't understand unintended consequences. And I think that that's the big issue that needs to be considered.
This is the 17th Symposium in the series of Knowledge in Space. The whole series is financially supported by the Klaus Tschira Foundation, and it is particularly interesting this year to have a foundation supporting this ongoing research and conversation series, while at the same time this year's focus is on the role of civil society and also foundations in the creation of knowledge. The participants of this symposium engage in interesting controversies regarding the relation of the civil society and the state, for example, while some address the positive impact and the support that philanthropy and foundations offer to education, research, and the creation of knowledge. Others highlight and reflect more critically the impact that civil movements and foundations in particular take in influencing state and policy design.
So in the future, we're at a really interesting time right now, at least in the US, in terms of people are questioning the power that philanthropy has. And in the last 5 years, the trust that the public has had in philanthropy has begun to wane as people have questioned the power of these very large foundations like the Gates Foundation to advance certain ideas above others, to anoint certain practices or models of policy without a lot of associated democratic debate. Foundations can really act as private institutions and are not held accountable to the public in the same way that an elected official will be. And I think there's likely to be more regulation of foundation involvement in policy and practice, both from the normative concerns of the public as to the power of foundations and private wealth to set the public agenda, but also in the immediate wake of the recent legal actions against the Trump Foundation, which was found to be violating laws against private foundations blatantly engaging in political acts. I think we're about to see some perhaps watershed regulation of foundations in the US, at least when it comes to political engagement.
The moral deficit of the global education discourse is that we're not talking about moral ends, we're only talking about technical ends. So the whole idea of competence in education is understood as a way of making people capable of fitting economic needs. When I think about education in the tradition of Aristotle, Dewey and others, I think about making people capable of leading a human life. That's not necessarily the same as fitting them for economic purposes.
In societies of transition, we know from our own European and German history that civil society organizations have been driving forces. The Berlin Wall would not have come down without civil society, nor would transition have happened in Hungary and Poland and in other countries in Central and Eastern Europe. So quite obviously what we can see, and we're seeing it happening everywhere, is that these unorganized and probably unorganizable processes of change happen where organization is less important, and that is the civil society arena or the civil society field. If you have a strict hierarchy, if you have strict lines of command, it's very difficult to generate ideas. So civil society is quite a hotbed, and that's the role I would always see more than any other, I suppose.
In Hong Kong and in other parts of the world, the government, of course, have very strong power in setting public agendas. An individual NGO usually is too weak to deal with big issues. We really need coalition, alliance, to pull together resources and talent so that we can make the society believe that we are going to create impact. And so we can draw attention from the media So this is the way to set agenda. So it's so important for NGO, civil society organization to come together as a coalition. More issues will emerge. How to build resources, how to resolve conflict. So this become very important to develop a mechanism for this NGO to resolve all these issues in order to create a really impactful alliance to set agenda.
So I'm particularly interested in the elements of different projects that are epistemic and in projects for which epistemology and an epistemic agenda is really at the core of their work. So evidence-based policy making is one of those projects. They're interested in getting better outcomes in a wide variety of topics in really any field, and their activism, their project, is really to get policymakers to think in terms of scientific evidence, to pay attention to the science in a rigorous way. And they're much more concerned with that mode of getting there, with the way of thinking, way of making decisions, than with the actual decisions that are made. This way of going about social change, this way of thinking about whose voices matter and how you know something is true and how you make solutions. And the how becomes the sort of long struggle, and the what we want to change, the episodic struggles, they kind of structure that longer struggle.
So if you look historically, it's like some of the early foundation forms, like Plato's academies, like the Library of Alexandria, like centers of learning. So it's like foundation on the one hand provide infrastructure for learning, libraries in the case of Carnegie's, like a lot of the American universities, Heidelberg University as well, as far as I understand, is a foundation model. So it's the infrastructure. The second one is about like being convener of different spaces. I mean, thanks to the Klaus Tschirert Foundation we're here, so it provides a space for discussion. And fourthly, also about like agenda setting, providing opportunities to hear voices that otherwise are not being heard.
Well, I think ideas are very powerful. I think there's probably not enough perspectives on exactly how civil society changes the conversation, especially when it comes to things, you know, from my own work, things like international development NGOs. You know, there's been a lot written about how, for instance, culture, so McDonald's spreads American culture into different parts of the world, right? But how do big foundations that fund local NGOs in different parts of the world also spread new ideas, new ways of looking at the world? But also, how do these big foundations get influenced by the people that they work with and the people that take their money? Because they also need some kind of legitimacy for their work. So it's sort of a two-way street.
I've learned so much. I think the economic geography has given me almost like a fourth dimension.
It takes you out of the set of ideas that you take for granted, both challenge to think in new ways.
Having an hour for each speaker is an incredible luxury.
It's a rare opportunity to interact with people who are addressing similar issues but from very different angles, and this is very exciting. In contemporary academia, most of the time we meet with people who are doing exactly the same kind of work.
And so I think it's been useful in trying to get a better understanding of how civil society emerges around the world and what the possibilities are for prospects for better democratization, inclusive development around the world.